Here we go. A lot of people have contributed to what we're going to be talking about today. We want to say many, many thanks to all those people and acknowledge that we have 6 speakers today, 3 of whom are on video and 3 of whom are live. I mean, they're as live as Zoom is. They're live on Zoom, I guess is the right way to say that. And our plan for the afternoon is to look at an overview of the whole map and go through the first 3 stages in some depth, do more of a summary of the last 3 stages, leave breakout time for you all to talk with each other and process what you're finding out about, what you think about what we've been sharing. And at the end, we'll talk about some resources that we'll be sending, some of which we'll be sending out immediately after this program, some of which are coming out over the next few months. And if you have questions along the way, please put them in chat so we can bring them up and talk about them at the end. We also know that a number of you have a good deal of experience, and some of you indicated that you have been in contact with a linked descendant or more than one. And so if you have observations or insights to add to what we're saying, to supplement what we're saying today, by all means, put those in chat. The chat log will be edited to make sure we don't violate confidentiality, but otherwise is going to be sent out along with the resource list. So whatever suggestions and guidance and insight people share, you'll be able to see what your fellow linked descendants have offered. So, on to the map. Angela Dickey and I talk to everybody who joins the Linked Descendants. And we've been doing this for a number of years. And part of our conversation with them is learning about their family histories and their research journey. And of course, people have shared about their research in other meetings and in express cafes. So I would say we've heard a lot of stories across the 200 or so people that have been involved in the Linked Descendants group at some time or other. And from all those stories, we've started identifying recurring patterns and themes and decided to turn those patterns into a map that shows stages and also allows us to talk about some typical experiences. We've also noticed another pattern that we've noticed is people joining the Linked Descendants group, some of them full of energy to rush out and get into action as soon as they possibly can, and others feeling uncertain or hesitant because they're not quite sure how to get started or how to get into the research. So we thought, it's a new year. This is a good time to review what this journey is like, what we've heard from a lot of people this journey is like, so that perhaps some of the people feeling urgent can settle in to their journey, and the people feeling uncertain can be encouraged to go on and take the next step. Nobody's journey is just like anybody else's journey, of course, but we hope that, as with in other situations, having a map gives you an overall sense, allows you to locate yourself, see what might be coming next, and have some reassurance that other people have taken this path before you and are here to tell their stories. The journey doesn't move smoothly, as you probably have all found out, from point A to point B to point C. In fact, it's messy and circular, and some stages take forever and ever, and some stages happen really quickly. But I'm going to introduce them to you in a linear fashion. so that we can get the content. And I'm going to begin with the discovery stage over there on the left. There are so many ways in which people discover their family heritage of slavery. And in some cases, it's confirming rather than discovering. Of course, some of those people don't even start this journey, so they don't get on the map. It's too hard, it's too painful, they just don't want to go any further. There are people who get interested, want to get started, and then get discouraged, sometimes by the people around them, by their own families. But plenty of enslaver descendants and plenty of enslaver descendants start learning about their family heritage and then are driven by this urgency, maybe it's guilt, to want to move directly into action. So they want to go from the far left box right into the box to its right without going through the rest of the process. And we don't recommend that for various reasons, but we know people do that. But for most of you who are here, you've actually proceeded on into the research stage. And as you know, there are special challenges for African American researchers because their ancestors enslavers didn't necessarily keep records, destroyed records, or kept them hidden. And as an African American researcher does this research, they may find themselves dealing with anger, shame, and distress as they discover the names of the people who raped their ancestors. Enslaver descendants tend to have fewer challenges with actually finding records, but they too can uncover shameful accounts of ancestors who were rapists, slave traders, or perpetrators of racial violence. And as a result of their work, so we move through that research box, researchers find linked descendants, people living now descended from an enslaver or descended from someone their ancestor enslaved. Sometimes they're able to track down those linked descendants, contact them, and connect. And at that point, they move on into the box on the right, where they build relationships and perhaps move on to do work together, like a family reunion, and then end up in where they're able to take reparative action and heal harms. Today, we're going to look particularly at the first 3 stages from discovery through contact in more depth, sharing information and guidance that we've been gifted with by many, many people, probably including a lot of you on Zoom today. And that will populate this map with stories and color and complexity. Just a word from one of the people that's been doing research for quite a while, is a longtime member of Linked Descendants, about her experience of the messiness of the journey, of the ways in which it's been hard for her, and the need to take time and process what comes out of the research.
Libby Flock, and I'm just going to share a little slice of my journey that has to do with this first part of the map here. And each stage and in between periods take time, and they're really best not rushed, and they're not linear. And I want to acknowledge that my specific perspective is that of a white woman with enslaver ancestors, so it's not going to be the same for everyone, but some of these truths are universal. And about 1.5 years ago, it suddenly hit me that I should look into my mom's Virginia roots. I'm a California girl. And I found the slave schedules right away. And within a few hours, I realized that there were 130 people that just 3 of my ancestors had enslaved. So it was a really big, rude awakening. I was grateful to find come to the table. I'm a Linked Descendants. I joined right away. And that was me in this initial discover, be told, become aware phase. And we can come back to this no matter how long we've been doing the journey, but this was my very first discovery stage. And I jumped right in. I treated it like I did my graduate thesis. I powered through. I ignored what I was feeling. I wasn't taking care of myself. I thought at the time that I could get all the answers if I kept searching for clues. I just thought it was a matter of ripping off the Band-Aid, pushing hard for a few months, no matter what it took, finding the truth, facing it all, and being done. That's not how it works, but I didn't know that at the time. I also wasn't allowing the anger and the grief and the shame to be processed. I didn't think I deserved to feel that because, you know, obviously my feelings were nothing compared to those that had been enslaved and hurt by my ancestors. So it's important that we don't wallow and let our big feelings paralyze us or dither for long periods of time and not take action. But it's also important that we don't shove everything down. It's this in-between stage between discovering and reacting and deciding next step, all where the blue arrows are. That's all processing. And, you know, if we take action immediately, if we jump from discovering all the way over to connecting with a linked descendant, we can definitely cause harm. I identified, Sharon and I identified a linked descendant within the first few months. And I really needed to slow down, process, digest, integrate this information. If we don't do that, we end up dumping it all on others. So thankfully, I worked with Sharon Morgan. She was a fantastic resource and teacher and supportive. Also joined an affinity group, worked with nonviolent communication. And I know now this is a circular, messy, it's ongoing work. And it's not linear. And what changes is we become better aware of what's going on with us and also our motivations. Let me just turn off my timer there. And it's a lifestyle change, right? It's a new identity, a new way to see the world through, a new lens. And we can't just suck it up and face the truth. There aren't just a few truths to learn. We need to take it in bite-sized pieces, but even though it's gut-wrenchingly painful, we can't plow ahead with white supremacist culture characteristics really driving us, and then we're just going to cause harm. So it's important we're taking action, but we can share what we learn, not hoard the information, but we can do this in a way that is giving freely and not putting the burden of relationship on our linked descendants. We can get there eventually and form close relationships, but we really need all these in-between places and be willing to go back, taking time to digest and integrate and acclimate to all this information. So it's a lifelong journey that we're on. And I'm just going to give a quick plug. Libby, Flock.
So let's get started with stage one. As I've talked to a lot of members of the Linked Descendants groups, no surprise, I found that descendants of enslaved people are usually aware of their ancestry, and even if they haven't yet gone into the research. Occasionally, there are African-American researchers who haven't really thought about the reality of an enslaver ancestor, and that when they bump into that, can find that disturbing. On the other hand, it's not unusual for descendants of enslavers to have grown up with no knowledge at all about their family's involvement with slavery. If anything, they've heard stories about their great-greats that idealize those people, emphasize their achievements, their riches, their good works, and their social standing, even their political standing. Linked descendants from enslaver families have talked about knowing slavery existed, knowing their ancestors lived on farms in the South, and being brought up to believe that their family had nothing to do with slavery. We've also been reminded from time to time in some conversations that in parts of the South, South Carolina for one, it was illegal for anyone, enslaver or enslaved, to talk about, much less criticize, slavery, and certainly not to support emancipation or abolition on pain of ostracism, financial ruin, or violence. So the don't talk rule in some families is, in some cases, a survival instinct that may have carried on into later generations. Why do people want to find their, or want to do this research? Again, through a series of conversations and interviews, we learned there are several types of motivation. One of them is curiosity. So when I talked to Ella, she told me about how, as a youngster, she wanted to know who were the people on the wall. And what she meant was the people in photographs on the wall of the staircase in her family home. In some cases, people grow up with a family historian in the family or a griot who told them stories. So Marvin remembers how his mother's mother would tell all the children stories about their ancestors and even show them old photographs when they took extended car trips across the country. He got hooked on learning more of his family history, and he is now a public historian. Brianna grew up with the relative in her family who knew all the stories, knew all the people, and not only in the family, but in the small town where they lived. And Brianna wanted to have that knowledge too. Brianna is now writing a book. From the time I was little, my grandmother took all of us to family reunions at an ancestral home place. I figured out on my own that my ancestors were enslavers, and I really wanted to know more. I wanted to meet those people, and here I am today. Some people get into researching their family because they have this desire to connect with their roots. Connie told me she can remember watching Alex Haley's TV show, Roots, and that sparked her curiosity and got her going on asking about her family history. The TV show actually made more Black people more comfortable to talk about slavery. At least that was her experience. Tony told Diane that Tony longed for connections to her ancestors in Louisiana, to the culture left behind when her family moved west to California. She wanted a connection to the food and the music. Sometimes the push comes from research findings by other family members. Angela recounts how her cousin showed her an old will detailing how an ancestor's Negro boy should be kept with the enslaver family, but the boy's mother, Nancy, was to be sold off. Angela says she thought her head would explode, and her response was to begin doing research into all of that. And in quite a few cases, we hear in our Get Acquainted meetings and in people's applications to join Coming to the Table, their journey starts after a parent or a close relative dies, and in the course of cleaning out the closets, somebody or the person we're talking to finds an album, a folder, a collection of letters or photographs, and they are spurred to do more. One woman told us how she found a box of her mother's papers a couple of weeks after her mother had died. And when she opened it and began to read through, finding the references to slavery and enslaved people, her grief was overwhelming and she couldn't stop crying. And as for that person finding her mother's papers, finding that folder or that box of materials for enslaver descendants can be devastating and heartbreaking. Enslaver descendants, as Libby alluded to, can have a sort of identity crisis. Their ancestors are not the people they thought they were. The family they're descended from is not the family they thought it was. Their heritage feels shameful. They feel guilty or immoral. These feelings are really hard to tolerate, and sometimes they lead a person to making poor choices. With members of the Linked Descendants group, we encourage them to start their research and simultaneously do their work to come to terms with their history, to construct a new, more honest identity, as Libby said, not to wallow and dither, and to become much more aware of the legacies of slavery and of white supremacy culture in their own lives. And what deters people from getting going with the research, or sometimes they start and then stop? What we hear most frequently from descendants, both of formerly enslaved people and descendants of enslavers, include strong feelings: fear, shame, rage. Some people are deterred by family or community rules. That's not a topic we discuss in this family. That's all in the past. Leave it alone. Why do you want to mess with ugly? And basically, don't ask, don't tell. Some folks don't get started because they don't know what to do, where to go, how to start, how to move on. Maybe they don't have records, or they don't know how to get hold of records. And they might be alone, isolated, the only person in their family who's asking questions, which is a pressure of its own. And they don't know anyone to ask for help. They don't have research buddies or genealogy associations or research mentors. Now that we've looked at why people start this journey and decide not to, Jerry's going to take us into a breakout time.
In preparation for our breakout groups, we want to remind everyone, especially the new members of Linked Descendants, to use the coming to the table touchstones as guidelines for a safe and productive conversation. Here are a few to remember. Listen to one another. Let another speaker finish and avoid interrupting. Respect strong feelings, your own and other people's. Allow them to be present, spoken aloud or not. Notice and check your assumptions. Use inquiry to learn more. Acknowledge if words are poorly said or might cause pain to someone else with an oops. Remember, there's a gap between intention and impact. Acknowledge if someone else's words cause pain or other strong emotions with an ouch. Remember the gap between intention and impact. Finally, be curious, especially if what someone else says is challenging to your thinking. Imagine what might have led them to this point of view. Consider what you could learn from them. Please take turns speaking and give everyone a chance to speak. And remember, what is said in the breakout stays in the breakout to make it safe to talk. For your getting started experience, we will be paired in 7-minute conversations, giving about 3 minutes to each person. Here are a set of things that you consider as prompts for your conversation. What is it or was it like getting started on the family history journey? How have people around you responded? Any resistance or difficulties? And what support or encouragement have you received? We'll put these questions in the chat window, so if you need to refresh on them as you have your conversations, you can do so.
Okay, and here we go with groups, with breakouts. I hope. It's not looking to me like the breakout rooms are opening.
Do you have to stop screen sharing first?
I'm going to try that. I think that's an awfully good suggestion. And I'm actually going to close the rooms and start over. Okay, options. Okay, hoping it works now. Sorry, this is slow, but manual seems to be my option. I've never had this happen before, where it's just not asking you to join.
But aren't there some people in breakout groups, Prinny?
I think that we're getting.
It
partway
seems like
there.
it's working because there's less and less
Thank
of us
you.
left in
Yes.
the main room.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay. Apologies. And if somebody ends up in a room alone, I will come in and put you in a room with somebody. These are not isolation chambers.
There she is.
There she is. Oops.
Let me turn off recording.
Yeah.
Oh
Come
no.
on.
Well, we'll cut it out.
Them before committing them to your narrative. There are two parts. First, to research input, and the second is doing the research. When there are many sources for facts and stories about your ancestors, remember to try to find multiple sources to confirm them before you add them to your narrative. Not all of the typical resources are available to African American researchers, especially for information before 1865. That is why it is so important for European Americans to share their resources with others. One of our interviewees said, "It has been hard to find farms and plantations where my ancestors were enslaved, and hard to find the enslaver families. I have found one enslaver ancestor, and there's a record for all of the enslaved people he manumitted in his will, but no information for the one man he did not manumit. That's very frustrating." Now, to move on into actually doing the research, as you gather information, Integrate what you've learned into your bigger picture. Always put what's learned in context with what's going on locally, globally, and socially. There will be desirable and undesirable information. So take time to process what you've learned. Get comfortable with the knowledge. And if you want to share what's learned, always be respectful to those it's about and for those receiving it. Do no harm. And remember, researching your family is an iterative process. The more you learn, the more you will want to learn. We will address the processing what you've learned later. Also, one resource that will be mentioned today is the Library of Congress. Well, Karan, I find your stories most fascinating, especially the one about Tom Mills. Just who is he and why did you do research on him?
Well, I began researching my family in 2007. And during that process, I stumbled upon Tom Mills as a result of looking at a family tree of a distant cousin on Ancestry, where she had really my mother's whole family. And I was just beginning, so I was like, oh, great, somebody's already done this. So in looking at the different names and going back to the 1800s, I just happened to tap on the son of my second great grandmother, whose name I knew, Emmeline. And in looking further at what was there for him, I came across an interview that had been conducted by the WPA employees for the Library of Congress, who were interviewing some 2,000 former slaves. And they did this throughout the country, and I knew that my family, my ancestors were in Texas. So I went right to Texas, and she had this on her tree, and it said Tom Mills. So that was really the first thing that I knew about Tom Mills. But as I began to read right in the beginning, Tom mentions his mother's name and his sister's names. I recall that my grandmother told me what her grandmother's name was, which was Emmeline, and Tom Mills says my mother's name was Emmeline Rowley. And I said, oh my gosh. And then he goes on to say, and my sisters were Ella and Matilda and Guadalupe, and I'm, oh my gosh, those are my grandmother's aunts. She told me about them. So then, of course, I just got so excited, continued to read and read, and was just enthralled with his recollection from age 4 to age 7, what it was like growing up in the settlement, and his whole family pretty much, not just his mother, but his great aunts, uncles, cousins, several generations were enslaved, if you will, by George Washington Patterson. And I was also looking for and hoping I could find who was the enslaved, who was the family that enslaved my ancestors. So here was just a gold nugget that just kind of fell in my lap, and it was just really mind-boggling, but very, very interesting reading what life was like for him and the various roles, jobs or tasks that he goes into detail. In particular, I heard myself say, oh, this is why my grandmother was such a good seamstress, because her grandmother made all the clothes for everybody. And, oh, no wonder why she was a good cook. My enslaved second grade cooked for everybody, for the Patterson family and everyone else. And Tom recounted that his other relatives in the settlement were a little annoyed with them because they ate in the big house, quote unquote, and ate the food that the Patterson family was eating. And he said, "Well, my mother cooked the food, so yeah." So that's how I found it.
Now let's go into a breakout pairs again to discuss.
We're going to look at the contact and connect stage, and we're going to look at it from 2 points of view.
Discoveries that we make on all stages of the journey often evoke strong emotional reactions, and they may need to be processed or even expressed. For African American researchers, this can be particularly challenging. Accounts of brutality, families torn apart, reading history through the words of their enslavers. Most texts and documents were written through the lens of white supremacy. For instance, the word servant, used by an author to describe a person they enslaved. These kind of examples are ubiquitous, and each one distorts the truth and causes harm. Most records were also written about African Americans, not by or from them. Researcher, writer, and longtime member of Linked Descendants, Tony Broussard, speaks with Prinny in this video clip about emotions which are evoked as she does research. For Tony, writing and sharing that writing has been her way to process.
I know you and I have talked about these emotions together, and I always learn something from listening to you. So I'd like if you could start us off by remembering back to when you first started doing your family history research and genealogical inquiry. What kinds of feelings came up for you in those days?
You know, just anger. It's they got away with everything. There is no accountability. And I had to research the enslaver to find out about what happened to my family. I had to read about all their so-called successes. They were heroes. They got rid of the Native Americans in the land, in different places. I had to read all of this just to get hopefully an inkling of what happened to my family. So it was like the crime was just up in my face, and the privilege, their feelings of privilege was up in my face, and they just like erased us. And that's what really came up for me in the beginning. And it still comes up for me, but I just know how to deal with it better now.
Okay. And do you tend to, is there somewhere in your body that you feel anger, or it feels some sort of certain way when you have it?
In my heart. I find myself grieving, because one of the ways I deal with my anger is to write and to read, and I take this research, and right now I'm writing another book, and I'm writing about my family, and it's the grieving. When I go to bed at night, it's like, wow, in my heart, I'm just grieving about something that I uncovered.
So I'd like for all of us to just take a minute and take a breath together and let Tony's words resonate. We can see that there are many ways to process the complex emotions which arise, and each person's going to be different. And on the first slide here I have, or the first square, I have ask for help. And I think if I had to do it over again, I would put Linked Descendants community because that's really what we have here. It's a very valuable resource. And I've discovered that simply by asking for help from someone who's further along the journey, I can get my questions answered and help process the material. Sometimes we just need to tell our stories, and sometimes we just need to deeply listen. I've been astounded at the generosity of members of the Linked Descendants community who have been available for Zoom calls or email exchanges. And they often generously share their own experiences in the CTT meetings, and particularly the Express Cafes. And as you'll hear later, we're working up some kind of group work too that we might be able to do this on a more formal way. The second way that we can help is by taking that accumulated knowledge, and it's been put into video and also on the blog called Bittersweet. Some of this knowledge is gained by years of experience. And one of the things that comes up frequently is anger and shame, particularly as we confront those painful historical facts. Some people, as Prinny talked about, feel overwhelmed. Sometimes they even stop altogether, but everybody should know that this is normal. This is something that many people come through, and the feelings just need to be faced and worked with. And so helping to understand this process in the context of the work that we're doing is a video that Linked Descendants has called Facing the Truth of History and Facing Anger and Shame. And you don't need to write down these resources because we're going to share them for you. Another way that many members of Linked Descendants have found useful is establishing a meditation or a mindfulness practice, and this can help regulate emotions. As many of you know, there's a large literature on intergenerational trauma held in the body, and it's also part of the Linked Descendants model. So another video facing the role of trauma and emotions is called Trauma and Encountering Our Legacy of Slavery. Other somatic practices can be really helpful in helping us free ourselves from racialized trauma and for preparing our bodies to do this work together. Many of us recommend and are working with the work of Reshma Menachem, who's the author of My Grandmother's Hands. Other kind of groups works, particularly that in affinity groups, can be really helpful in taking our work to a deeper level. Linked Descendants doesn't sponsor affinity groups yet, but you can start your own. For example, 3 of us started about 2 or 3 years ago to study whiteness, and we've used books and films and other educational materials. And we found it really valuable in processing the particular emotions that come up around this kind of work. There are also online classes that you can find, and they're done by various organizations and Facebook groups. And one we would recommend is Our Black Ancestry. And the last one that I have up here of many possibilities is creative expression. Because sometimes I just find that when the work gets really abstract, really stuck in a grief place or some other difficult place and I need to move forward, I can turn to art or writing and sometimes ritual. Many people have found that keeping an intentional or ancestral altar can be really helpful in processing some of this. And African-American researcher Beverly Bevell has a very interesting practice where she recreates African dolls, and she says that it honors the old tradition, and it's an outlet that allows her to touch, feel, and recreate the narrative in a format that speaks to her soul and also deeply connects her to her ancestors, helping her understand what they might have felt or experienced. For many people in Linked Descendants, the ongoing writing pods are a safe place to work with your family history through writing their stories. There's something that I would really recommend in Bittersweet, and this was a project that I think there's it's been done 5 times now, where people have been invited to put several of these things together in a creative way. So to create a collage around your family narrative, and also to write about it. And I really invite you to go there and look at these, because they're very powerful, both to do and to read. So I'm sure a lot of you all have other ideas, and we're going to break out in a minute. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that through the words actually of Allison Thomas, that these are an iterative process, and it's not unusual in every single stage to spiral through them over and over again. Each stage hopefully leading to action and repair. And Allison Thomas speaks to this cycle as she sees each iteration helping her see herself in a new way, with a new identity through a new lens.
Libby's covered part of this, but again, it's about allowing yourself time to go through these steps so that they sink in. And I use the model of a spiral, because I feel like I think I figure stuff out, and then I look at a document again, or think about a relationship, and I revisit, and then I spiral up, and I revisit and spiral up. It's a constant process. It is the opposite linear. And part of this is it takes time, especially as someone who descends from enslavers, to shift your identity, your point of view out of the white-centered world that we have grown up in and is so embedded in our DNA. And so that's where your identity shifts, and then you can read stories of the same events and they have a different impact. And I would also urge that this is not only about ancestral research or history. You have to learn the history as well as your family, and you just understand the context for things. But it is also about doing your own work on your unearned racial advantages, white privilege, and those aspects of it, because you need to be able to decenter your whiteness. So in that sense, it really connects so closely with coming to the table and the overall focus of this organization to heal the harms of slavery, which requires this kind of identity shift. And so those of us who find ourselves doing this through Linked Descendants do it in this context. So I really don't have much more to say. Libby's.
So now we're going to go.
I want to start with observations that have been shared with me about what might be going on for some African American researchers as they make contact with European American linked descendants. European American linked descendants need to keep in mind that for an African American researcher, finding and contacting a linked descendant who might share oral history, documents, or other kinds of information is a big deal. It may be critical to filling in some part of their family tree. It's also important for European Americans and enslaver descendants to understand the weight and the possible pain associated with taking that step of making contact for an African American researcher for a variety of reasons. For one thing, making contact with an enslaver descendant means the African American researcher is reaching out directly to a descendant of the person who held their ancestors in bondage and inflicted the harms of slavery. Obviously, the enslaver descendant is not the guilty party, but it has meant taking an unflinching look at the past and the people who were the guilty parties. Another facet is that an African American researcher is hoping their European American linked descendant can share information, since enslavers broke up and destroyed enslaved families, and family records and stories couldn't so readily be handed down from grandparents to children to grandchildren the way they might have been within a European American family. Furthermore, the American Slave Society didn't keep institutional records of enslaved people because they were considered property, not people. And the records that were kept further dehumanized enslaved people by showing them no names, just X's or tick marks. Of course, after the Civil War, or even during the Civil War, some enslaver families and even whole communities destroyed or hid records of enslavement. And then a dynamic to keep in mind on the part of an enslaver descendant, a European American, is that when an African American researcher is reaching out to an enslaver descendant, there are echoes and resonances of the white supremacy culture power dynamic. The asker is in the less powerful position, and the person being asked has the power to say yes or no. So these are factors that can be present with African American researchers who are reaching out to enslaver descendants, and we ask those descendants to take all of this on board and keep it in mind when they make or receive a contact. There's another set of factors affecting European American enslaver descendants, which are also complicated and fraught, and can be useful for us to lay out for the African American researchers that are trying to connect with us. The European American researcher has, of course, been intentionally looking for people, their ancestors enslaved, and those people's descendants. It's not something they have to do to fill in their own family tree necessarily. And if they get scared, they may hesitate. As they've gotten into the research, enslaver descendants are facing the fact that they are descended from that they're descended from enslavers can be painful, shameful, guilt-provoking, and upsetting. And processing these feelings at the same time that they're learning more about slavery can lead to even stronger feelings like horror or rage. Painful feelings and shame about family history can sometimes push an enslaver descendant to take steps that are more problematic than helpful. Sometimes they want to rush out and call or go meet in person their linked descendant and pour out all their feelings. Or they want to apologize profusely and repeatedly. Sometimes they want to rush into taking reparative action right away without even forming much of a connection or a relationship, and without processing the impact for themselves. And in a couple of cases, we've had people join Linked Descendants telling us about their unilateral plans for reparations before they've actually even identified enslaved people or descendants of enslaved people in their research. Another factor to remember on the part for European American researchers is, of course, the discomfort that all too many European Americans have about connecting with any African American. And then that's compounded by this difficult historical connection. It can paralyze the researcher or lead them to reach out awkwardly, thoughtlessly, or inappropriately. Sometimes the fact of being linked to an African American through slavery leads enslaver descendants to assume that there's more of a relationship with the linked descendant than that person wishes to have now or ever. And if the two linked descendants are genetically related, even more complicated feelings come up on both sides, with sometimes the enslaver descendant assuming there's an automatic family relationship and wanting to call the African American linked descendant cousin, even if the African American isn't at that point, doesn't want that kind of connection, not now and maybe never. So all of these factors tell us that there's a lot going on in the stage of making contact and hoping to create a connection, a lot going on below the surface. Now I have some to-dos to offer. The first set here are some mindsets that can help enslaver descendants, keeping in mind to be respectful, patient, gently friendly as opposed to overwhelmingly friendly, keeping a commitment to do no harm, showing empathy, and showing thoughtfulness. We strongly recommend to enslaver descendants that they think through their approach, both what they might say in writing and what they might say in person when they get to that point. Try that approach out on at least one other person to make sure that it really does come across as clear, polite, and unobtrusive. And most important, keep the linked descendant that you're reaching out to at the center of the conversation. And in the linked descendants group, enslaver descendants commit that if we are contacted by an African American, whether it's a linked descendant or a family history researcher that we may not be linked to, that we commit to always responding. Don't blow them off. Even if the only response you can send is, I haven't done that research, or I don't have those documents, or I haven't looked at that part of my family yet, and offer to follow up with the person when you do have something to share. This is information here about where to look for linked descendants. So once you've identified somebody, where to find them and how to contact them. All of this detail is in the resource list that we'll be sending you after today's meeting. So I just want to hit one highlight. Enslaver descendants, make your first contact in writing, a letter or an email. Don't call, don't text, because writing gives people a chance to process what they've received, and maybe they don't feel like responding. So it leaves them room. And I'm speaking from having heard about this. I'm assuming no one on the Zoom right now would do it, but whatever you do, don't go to the home or the workplace of a linked descendant. Write first. And we have some suggested points that you might include in your first outreach for an enslaver descendant reaching out to a linked descendant. And the only point that I want to highlight here is when you formulate this communication, think in terms of an elder, of a respected member of your community, and err on the side of being a little more formal, knowing you can always become less formal as you actually get acquainted. And what is it that deters enslaver descendants from reaching out at all? Or I'm sorry, not deters them. Here are the mistakes they make. And these are all mistakes that we've heard stories about and with a few blushes may have made ourselves. Don't show up unexpectedly in person, and don't bring to a meeting or send in advance any upsetting documents or stories. An African-American woman told me about someone showing up on her doorstep, mistake number one, and handing her the recently discovered bill of sale for one of her ancestors. And the woman, the African-American woman that was telling me the story was absolutely devastated, completely unprepared for all of that. When you do reach out, enslaver descendants, don't present a resume of your credentials when you introduce yourself. That's so white supremacy culture. So not people to people. Do observe the usual social amenities, so the people to people stuff of greetings and small talk when you write and when you first speak. And that means not charging into the heart of the matter without saying hello, no matter how anxious you feel. Don't cry. Don't gush with emotion. If you feel that strongly, you're not quite ready to get in touch. Keep processing. Don't apologize profusely and repeatedly, and whatever you do, don't ask a linked descendant for forgiveness. Do encourage the linked descendant you're contacting to tell their story, to talk about their research. So keep them in the center and focus on what they have to say. And that means not starting with yourself and not talking nonstop about yourself, your research, your findings, your feelings. It also means paying close attention to the dynamics and the energy of a conversation so that you know, okay, we're getting connected here. This is a point where I could say something about myself. I could bring up something I've learned. Of course, if you get asked, respond. Let the other person's thoughts and feelings emerge at their pace. Keep a tight grip on your own boundaries. So no nonstop questioning, no intrusive questioning. And again, all of these tips will be in the resource list. Finally, Karan shared another story with us, a very successful story of having contact with a person that my term I refer to as a linked researcher, so that through this person, she learned a lot more about her own family.
Then you had another lucky part of your story, I think, when you met Mr. Neil Myers. Can you tell me about him and how he helped you with your research?
Okay, well, Tom, Neil Myers had built a tree on Ancestry using the information that he had also found in the volume from the Library of Congress, in hopes of trying to find any African American descendants of Tom Mills, because he knew that he had a relative who was related to the Patterson, the enslaved, the Patterson family. And so again, on Ancestry, I come across this one particular tree, and who had my mother's enslaved ancestors on there. And so out of curiosity, I'm clicking on different ones, and he also had Tom Mills. So now I'm like, I've got to find out who this is, because I thought maybe it's someone else related to, but nevertheless, I just needed to know. So I sent this person an email, and he emailed me back and told me that his name was Neil Myers, and he sent me pictures of himself and his family. And so then I said, oh, okay, we're European descent. Now, of course, he knew what I was, but I didn't know what he was until I saw the pictures, and from that moment on, we just developed a very warm and strong friendship. And he indicated to me that his cousin, and from my own tracing, I realized that his cousin married the third married the third great grandson of, in other words, the great great grandson of George Washington Patterson, who owned Tom Mills and the several generations of his family, and who were my ancestors. So at the time, Neil was living in Uvalde, and Tom Mills this interview took place in Uvalde when Tom Mills was about 88 years old. And Neil told me that since he lived in Uvalde at the time, he would try to find the settlement where they all lived. And so about maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, he sent me numerous pictures, which includes the pictures that you just showed before we began this interview. And I just lost it with emotion and imagining my ancestors built that house. My great-great-grandmother cooked the food there, and in another picture, he sent me a picture of the well, and it was just truly a gift. So, and I planned to go to Uvalde, but then COVID occurred, so I haven't gotten there yet. And Neil and I have not personally met yet, but we feel like we already know each other. And I know one day that we will, but we do continue to email and stay in touch.
I'm so happy you had such a good research experience. It gives all of the rest of us hope.
Oh, gosh, yes, I hope for you, too.
Thank you. Well, Karan, I find your stories most fascinating, especially the one about Tom Mills. Just who is he, and why did you do research on him?
Well, I began researching my family in 2007, and during that process, I stumbled upon Tom Mills as a result of looking at a family tree of a distant cousin on Ancestry, where she had really my mother's whole family. And I was just beginning, so I was like, oh, great, somebody's already done this. So in looking at the different names and going back to the 1800s, I just happened to tap on the son of my second great grandmother, whose name I knew, Emmeline. And in looking further at what was there for him, I came across an interview that had been conducted by the WPA employees for the Library of Congress, who were interviewing some 2,000 former slaves. And they did this throughout the country, and I knew that my family, my ancestors were in Texas. So I went right to Texas, and she had this on her tree, and it said Tom Mills. So that was really the first thing that I knew about Tom Mills. But as I began to read right in the beginning, Tom mentions his mother's name and his sister's names. I recall that my grandmother told me what her grandmother's name was, which was Emmeline, and Tom Mills says, my mother's name was Emmeline Rowley. And I said, oh my gosh. And then he goes on to say, and my sisters were Ella and Matilde and Guadalupe, and I'm, oh my gosh, those are my grandmothers. Oh, she told me about them. So then, of course, I just got so excited, continued to read and read, and was just enthralled with his recollection from age 4 to age 7, what it was like growing up in the settlement, and his whole family pretty much, not just his mother, but his great aunts, uncles, cousins, several generations were enslaved, if you will, by George Washington Patterson. And I was also looking for and hoping I could find who was the enslaved, who was the family that enslaved my ancestors. So here was just a, gold nugget that just kind of fell in my lap. And it was just really mind-boggling, but very, very interesting reading what life was like for him and the various roles, jobs or tasks that he goes into detail. In particular, I heard myself say, oh, this is why my grandmother was such a good seamstress, because her grandmother made all the clothes for everybody. And, oh, no wonder why she was a good cook. My enslaved second great cooked for everybody, for the Patterson family and everyone else. And Tom recounted that his other relatives in the settlement were a little annoyed with them because they ate in the big house, quote unquote, and ate the food that the Patterson family was eating. And he said, well, my mother cooked the food, so so that's how I found it.
Yeah. Jerry, would you be willing to recap the story? Thank you for the suggestion. Jerry?
Yes. As we heard about earlier, Karan was researching one of her great-great-great-grandfathers, Tom Mills, or I'm sorry, he was a great-great-great-uncle. Because a gentleman in Texas was courageous enough to document a family tree that he saw in some documents that were belonging to the family that had enslaved Mr. Tom Mills. He put that tree on Ancestry.com, where Karan was able to find it, and they started communicating. He was so generous during the pandemic in exchanging information with her, and because she couldn't travel, he actually went to the settlement site and took pictures of the settlement and shared them with Karan, so that while she couldn't travel, she could at least see where the homestead was. He sent her quite a few pictures. It turns out this gentleman is of European descent, and is not related to the Patterson family, but was generous enough to do the research when he saw the names in a document and put together a family tree, and therefore facilitated the connection between the two of them to start exchanging information. I understand the Karan may have an opportunity to meet him in the future. They have left that door open so they can meet in person as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for sharing the rest of that story. And we're halfway through the journey, in a manner of speaking, but we're reaching the stages of ongoing conversations, building relationships, the stage that you could hear Karan moving into with Neil Meyer, and a couple of observations about them. First of all, when we first, 11 years ago, when Linked Descendants started meeting and started talking to each other, most folks were somewhere between getting started and making contact and connecting. Many fewer people had gotten into the later stages. So we weren't getting as many stories, and we weren't able to see patterns as clearly. And then the relationships tend to be more diverse, more particular to the sets of people who are in them. I'm hopeful that we will learn more, we will hear more stories, and may be able to flesh out the rest of the map more fully. So we're at the end of what we know best about the journey right now. And we keep referring to this resource list that we're going to send you. So here's what we've got by way of resources coming soon and coming later. The resource list that we're putting together will have the detailed tips from Contact and Connect. It is also a list of all the references on the Coming to the Table website. So other websites, blogs, Facebook groups, etc., that have been put one place or another on the Coming to the Table group are now going to be all in one document for you to use as sort of a one-stop shopping. We will look through the chat and share that, making sure that nobody's confidentiality is broken, and you will get a link to today's video. Starting very soon, additional resources are the genealogy study groups, which are due to start up in February. So very soon there should be announcements and opportunities to register for those. In March, we have the first of a series of genealogy workshops. So keep eyes open for that. And a couple of folks are really interested in creating, I think what I would call it is a genealogy directory. So from their own research experience, and then also doing some further scanning around on the web to make a list of where are all the places that you can go and learn about how to do family history research. We're really taken by the success of the writing pods, people getting together and supporting each other around writing about their family history. And we're wondering if folks would like us to offer research pods. So you'd be able to join up with a little group of people to be research buddies to each other. If that's something you'd be interested in setting up, as well as possibly joining, please either put that in the chat or reach out to me directly. And along with pods, some folks might like to have research mentors, an individual that they can ask questions of one-on-one. If you'd be available in the future to be a mentor to a researcher, please let me know that, and we will also be reaching out to some of the more experienced researchers in the group to see if that's a possibility for any of you. So we hope to keep supporting people on this journey in various ways. We are coming to the close of the designated time for today's meeting. But we will take time to answer questions. What I want to make sure is to say thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. And also for many of you, the contributions that you made knowingly or less knowingly to the stories and to our understanding of the map. And if this is the time you need to sign off, I wish you good afternoon or good evening, and look forward to seeing you again. And we will go on to taking time for questions. Jerry and Diane and I are happy to stay on for a while after the designated end. So if we have lots of questions, lots of people want to talk, we'll hang in there with you. So time for questions, if to the extent that we have them, and otherwise, goodbye and good evening. So Jerry or Diane, have you had a chance to hunt up questions from earlier in the meeting?
In my perusal, I didn't see lots of questions early on. So the biggest question just came in now, I guess based on your last chart, which was, how would the research pods differ from genealogy study groups?
In my head, but anybody that wants to get involved in setting them up can take them in a direction that's meaningful to them. But in my head, a pod would be as much about encouragement. It might be the place that you go when you say, dang, I found a linked descendant and I want to contact them. Can I read you guys the email that I've drafted? It might be a place where you come across the perpetrator of a lynching among your ancestors, and you'd really like to share your feelings about that with people who won't think you're weird and will understand. So that was my my concept of a difference. Does that help? I see a question from Laurel, but I'm not sure Laurel is still on. Oh, there she is. There's Laurel. How do you join? Laurel, why don't I send you the link so that rather I won't tell it to you unless somebody has it immediately.
I put it in the chat. I believe it's a link to the coming to the table page.
There you go. Thank you, Tanya.
And welcome, Laurel. So honored you're here and joining Linked Descendants.
Yeah.
This is the group that in years of processing helped me learn how to research and actually reach out to a linked descendant. So super honored that you're here.
And Tanya, you also shared the resource for people researching ancestral history in New England. So we'll make sure that'll be in the resource list. A request for volunteers to do various things with Linked Descendants. I'm scrolling back to see if there were any other questions.
Karan
she has a comment.
Yes.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Was it Karan who has a comment?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Karan, please.
My comment is, first of all, thank you for the invitation, but the audio was pretty garbled. And so what I wanted to offer or suggest is that I provide in writing some of my responses if they could be placed perhaps on the blog.
Sure.
Okay.
We will, anything you want to contribute to the blog will be joyfully and gratefully received.
Well, I'll start with some of my discussion with Jerry. And so Jerry, I'll get back with you just to kind of refresh those questions. I'll be glad to write it.
And we might be able to post the two video clips directly to the site as well. We'll see if we can get that done so everyone can hear it for themselves.
Because the clips before they were embedded in the PowerPoint were not garbled.
Oh, okay.
So we have an ungarbled version of you making all your points. And we could look for another way to share that reduces the technology problem. Angela.
I just wanted to point out, I saw a question in the chat, which you need to address, Prinny, which is, are we allowed to share any of these things with non-coming to the, or non-linked descendants?
Well, this particular presentation, after Tom DeWolf does some magic video editing and YouTube uploading, will be available on the Linked Descendant, or on the Coming to the Table website in the Linked Descendants page. So in essence, it becomes available to the public that way, and the resource list will be available with it. So yes, but I really appreciate that person asking, because not everything is necessarily being offered for public sharing.
And I think Tonya had a question about the composition of the groups. Are they going to be by region?
Which groups?
The
I
research
think the research
study
pods.
They haven't been designed yet.
Right.
So
How
if
would
they
you like
should
them
be
to
by
be?
region, we will put that on the list. Tanya, let me ask you, does it make sense to do them by regions where people live for time zone reasons, to do them by regions people are researching?
Because I'm researching New England, I will say I have a very strong bias. The research you're doing around New England is so different. Like, we don't have slave schedules, for example. We're often a century earlier, and I can offer assistance and help to people trying to research in that area.
Super.
So I think there's tremendous power. And I've also seen it. I mean, I've jumped into, for example, an African American Genealogical Society call in a specific state, and to hear a friend present her research. And it's like, it's exciting when somebody shares stories and names, and then someone else is like, they know that person.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's where I put Atlantic Black Box in the chat. Does anyone here have New England ancestry? Okay.
Okay. I'm again looking for other questions, and I think that's it. Does anybody have a question live in person, as you've already been doing? Any other? Okay. Well, thank you. And thanks for being here, and those of you who appeared on screen. Thank you for that, Libby, Allison, and Karan. And maybe
Tony.
as we end and Tony, yes, thank you. As we end, maybe Diane and Jerry and I can debrief a little bit. Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.